Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. Israeli forces storm Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza as they track down Hamas fighters, ordering Palestinians to evacuate the area. The European Union's foreign policy chief accuses Israel of provoking famine in Gaza and using starvation as a weapon of war. Vladimir Putin vows to prioritise what he calls Russia's special military operation in Ukraine after claiming a landslide victory in the presidential election. And China's foreign minister visits New Zealand and Australia, his first trip there in 7 years. Israeli forces have stormed the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, saying that Hamas fighters have regrouped there. Gaza's health ministry says the raid has resulted in deaths and injuries. UNICEF says more than 13,000 children have been killed in the fighting as the Gaza death toll approaches 32,000 people. A United Nations-backed report says famine is expected in the north of the enclave between now and May, with half of the total population facing what's being called catastrophic hunger. The outgoing Palestinian Prime Minister has issued a plea for help.
This is a plea to humanity on Gaza and the struggles of people in Gaza, to the world leaders, in the name of humanity, democracy, and international law. Don't your hearts bleed at empty stomachs of children suffering from hunger? Don't your heart bleed at how humanity is killed and trampled by the trucks of occupation tanks? Don't your bombs make your hearts bleed as they fall like rain and the occupation army raid Al-Shifa hospital today and kills the patients? How long will you remain motionless on the side of Israel, the criminal state?
Let's talk to our correspondent, Noor Harazin, who's in Rafah in Gaza. Noor, what else can you tell us about this raid?
Well, overnight clashes erupted between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces around the Al-Shifa hospital, close to the heart of central Gaza city. According to eyewitnesses, including medical staff and journalists who are inside the Al-Shifa hospital, they said that the Israeli tanks and Israeli troops started shooting towards Palestinians who are in the open yard, the front yard of the Al-Shifa hospital. The shells hit the main building of the Al-Shifa surgery building of the Al-Shifa hospital. For now, there is actually no connection with the people inside the Al-Shifa hospital. The latest that we got was a few voice messages and calls from Palestinian journalists around 6 hours ago, talking about how the Israeli forces are now forcing those displaced Palestinians inside the Al-Shifa hospital to evacuate the Al-Shifa hospital. Right now, the hospital is a closed Israeli military base. The eyewitnesses are talking about dozens that were killed in this Israeli raid on the Al-Shifa hospital, including Faiq al-Mabhouh, who is a commander, a police commander in Gaza. Also, the Israeli forces have arrested Ismail al-Ghul, who is a TV correspondent for Al Jazeera, and also arrested the whole Al Jazeera team.
And Noor, there's been a report backed by the United Nations saying that famine is expected in Gaza by May.
Well, yes, the Gaza Strip is facing its worst humanitarian crisis, and the things are just getting worse and worse day after day. All of the humanitarian aid that is being allowed to the Gaza Strip is not enough to meet the needs of the people. What really enters the Gaza Strip is just 10% of what the Gaza Strip needs. If we are talking about the aerial drops, if we are talking about the trucks allowed from the Egyptian side, if we are talking about this new maritime bridge from Cyprus to Gaza. All of this aid is not enough to meet the needs of the people of Gaza. It looks like here the people in Gaza have so many ways to die. It is like they're living in this death triangle. If they don't get killed by the Israeli attacks and Israeli bombings, they could die because of starvation and famine, or they could die because of the spread of infections, diseases, and also the lack of medicine and medical supplies.
Noor, thank you very much. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Rafah. Israel will offer a 6-week ceasefire for the return of 40 hostages in the latest ceasefire talks in Qatar. That's according to an Israeli official. He says Israel will send a high-level delegation headed by the chief of its intelligence agency, Mossad. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Sarah Coates, who's in Tel Aviv. Sarah, what else can you tell us about these talks?
Hello there, Robin. We do understand that this Israeli delegation headed up by David Barnea is now on the way to Qatar to engage in these very high-level, very sensitive talks in Qatar. The delegations on the ground will, of course, include the Qataris, the Egyptians, some US representatives, and what we understand is they will be directly or indirectly, I should say, negotiating with Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But this is expected to take some time simply due to the lack of communications going on right now in the Gaza Strip. Now, the initial framework the Israelis are expected to present is a 60-day ceasefire with the release of some 35 to 40 hostages in return for potentially up to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. It would be during the second phase that a ceasefire would be discussed. That is what Hamas wants, but this is something that we've been hearing time and time again from the Israelis that would be a red line. Israel continues to say that it will not agree to any kind of ceasefire that would leave Hamas in power in the Strip. And we've heard from the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just over the last few days speaking to US media saying that this operation down in that southern city of Rafah will go ahead despite this growing international pressure.
And Sarah, we've been hearing about this IDF raid on the Al-Shifa hospital. What's Israel said about it?
The IDF has just released a statement saying it now has full control of the Shifa hospital, calling on Hamas members inside to surrender. We do understand, according to the military, that this began very early this morning when troops arrived. The army says that they were fired upon by people from inside the hospital and that when they returned fire, a number of people were killed, others injured. We do understand, according to the IDF, that they have killed Faik Mabu, who was a senior Hamas commander and the head of the internal security operations in the Strip. He was reportedly killed during a firefight as the military were trying to take him into custody. Now, the IDF continues to say it is not trying to harm civilians. We do know that many people are sheltering inside that hospital, nor doctors. Let's take a listen to the IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari.
Our war is against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza. We seek no harm to the civilians that Hamas is hiding behind, which is why we will conduct this operation with caution and care, while ensuring that the hospital continues its important functions. We call upon all Hamas terrorists hiding in hospital, surrender immediately. Medical facilities should never be exploited for terror. Hamas must be held accountable.
And Robin, it has just been confirmed that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will speak to US President Joe Biden in just under half an hour for the first time in around a month as these tensions between Washington and Israel grow over Israel's operation inside Gaza.
Sarah, thank you very much. Our correspondent Sarah Coates there in Tel Aviv. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has accused Israel of provoking famine in Gaza. He made the comments as EU foreign ministers meet in Brussels. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is there. So, Stuart, strong words from Josep Borrell. What else did he say?
Yeah, his summary of all of this, he says we're no longer on the brink of famine in Gaza. There is one already there. And he emphasised it's not a natural disaster, it's one brought about by those that do not let aid into Gaza, i.e. he's pointing the finger at the Israelis there. And more than that, he suggested that this was not an accident of the way the war was being conducted, but Josep Borrell, the EU's highest diplomat, suggested it was a deliberate act.
I'm coming from Washington, and I dare to say, well, yes, Israel is provoking famine. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Yes, starvation is used as a weapon of war. Let's say that.
Now, he says hundreds of trucks are waiting at the border, trucks which are ready to supply months' worth of aid. But Israel says that these failures are due to the aid agencies and a lack of proper coordination, and it also blames Hamas as taking the aid intended to go to the residents in Gaza.
And Stuart, despite the condemnation of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the EU has pledged less humanitarian aid for this year. Have they said why?
Yeah, if we were talking just about Gaza, that may be one explanation, that there is plenty of aid ready to go there, but it's not being allowed in. But this funding relates to funding for all around the world, where the European Union says climate change and conflict are the biggest drivers of instability and also poverty. And yet that has decreased, that level of funding from EU member states and the European Union institutions, by about $500 million per year. And with that, the EU humanitarian and crisis management chief here in Brussels says that it's a solid amount that has been pledged this year, but it is one that could be better. Josep Borrell, the head diplomat, also saying that he believes that there are more people in need of emergency assistance than ever before, and yet no explanation from member states as to why that figure has decreased.
Stuart Smith in Brussels, thank you very much. The Taliban says Pakistan carried out 2 airstrikes inside Afghanistan, killing at least 8 people, including 3 children. The group strongly condemned the attacks in the provinces of Khost and Paktika, describing them as reckless. Islamabad's foreign ministry said it had targeted terrorists responsible for a suicide attack on Saturday, which killed 7 of its troops. An exchange of fire over the border area was reported after the airstrikes. South Korea and Japan say Pyongyang fired several ballistic missiles into the sea while US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was visiting Seoul. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida condemned the launches, saying they threatened peace in the region. The show of force comes a week after the end of joint US-South Korean military exercises. Bulgaria's Foreign Minister Maria Gabriel has agreed to form a new government after the country's Prime Minister stepped down earlier this month. After elections last year, the country's political parties agreed to rotate leaders every 9 months. Gabriel will now serve her 9-month term with her centre-right GERB party in government. Vladimir Putin has claimed a landslide victory in Russia's presidential election, with exit polls showing him getting more than 87% of the vote. The new term will give Putin 6 more years in power. In his victory speech, Putin vowed to prioritise what he called Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Voting took place over 3 days, with officials claiming more than 77% turnout. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova, who's in Moscow. Dasha, what else has President Putin had to say after his victory?
Well, indeed, after the early results of the Central Election Commission were announced, Vladimir Putin headed to his headquarters at the Gostinny Dvor in downtown Moscow. He said that the high turnout in this year's presidential election was an indicator of the trust that the Russian people do put into the Russian government. He said that the Russians voted for the strong, independent and sovereign country. He also has said that all of the promises that have been made will be implemented, that that he decided that he would not promise anything he cannot do. So every project that was announced before should be implemented. He was also talking about the situation in Ukraine, saying that Moscow is willing to engage into the negotiations, but once again reiterating the Russian position that it is Ukraine that is not willing to talk, but also hinted that the operation would continue, with Russia seeking to establish the so-called buffer zone on the territory of Ukraine in order to make sure that the Russian regions that have been under the constant fire from the Ukrainian side are now secure and are without the reach of the Ukrainian attacks that have been fired from the Ukrainian side. So obviously there were hints that the operation would continue, and this is probably an indication in which direction that will be headed.
And Putin also talked publicly for the first time about the death of Alexei Navalny. What did he say?
Well, indeed, for the first time in years, we've heard the Russian President Vladimir Putin actually calling Alexei Navalny by name. Navalny, labeled as terrorist and extremist in Russia, died last month, and the circumstance remain quite a mystery for many of his supporters. He died in the Arctic penal colony. According to the Russian president, there was indeed an arrangement and an idea, an offer on the table to exchange Alexei Navalny for some prisoners in an international prisoner swap. And Putin said that the people who offered that to him were outlining this idea when Vladimir Putin himself said, yes, this should be taking place, without listening to the end of this idea. He said there should be one condition, that Navalny would never return to Russia. He said many would probably be surprised by this announcement. But again, he said that what happened was that happened, and Navalny later died in prison without this idea actually being implemented. That confirms earlier reports by Alexei Navalny's supporters that that deal was indeed on the table and under discussion. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov on Monday has commented on this, saying that the very fact that Putin was talking about Navalny and this idea shows the openness of the Russian president.
Dasha, thank you very much. The correspondent Dasha Chernysheva in Moscow. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in New Zealand, his first visit there in 7 years.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. Israeli forces storm Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza as they track down Hamas fighters, ordering Palestinians to evacuate the area. The European Union's foreign policy chief accuses Israel of provoking famine in Gaza and using starvation as a weapon of war. And Vladimir Putin vows to prioritize what he calls Russia's special military operation in Ukraine after claiming a landslide victory in the presidential election. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has met New Zealand's Prime Minister in Wellington on the first leg of a 5-day trip that will also take in Australia. It's the first visit by a Chinese foreign minister to the two Pacific nations in 7 years. Our correspondent Owen Poland reports.
Last time that China's foreign minister visited New Zealand was 7 years ago in 2017, but the political and economic landscape has changed quite dramatically since then. As the foreign minister for New Zealand's new centre-right coalition government, Winston Peters said he was honoured to host Wang Yi in the Grand Hall of New Zealand's Parliament, which he said is the heart of New Zealand's democracy. Mr. Peters says the bilateral meeting was a valuable opportunity to reflect on the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, especially after the disruption caused by the COVID pandemic. Mr. Wang's visit marks 10 years since China and New Zealand signed a comprehensive strategic partnership, and Mr. Peters says it's now timely to discuss how the two countries can best work together over the next decade. Mr. Peters said that he appreciated the opportunity to cooperate with China bilaterally and to work together on regional and international issues of importance to both countries. Wang Yi also had a separate meeting with Prime Minister Chris Luxon, who said that working together with China was really critical to building relationships across the region. Mr. Luxon said that the two-way trade and people-to-people contacts with China were mutually beneficial to both countries and that New Zealand looked forward to building on that relationship.
We obviously have a thriving two-way trade of $38 billion that is mutually beneficial to both countries. We also believe we have strong people-to-people connections and certainly have a strong, passionate, vibrant Chinese community in New Zealand that I think has made New Zealand a much richer and a much better place.
The Prime Minister's message was well received by Wang Yi, who praised New Zealand's rational, pragmatic and positive policy towards China, which obviously augurs well for future relations between the two countries.
I know you have always attached great importance to the relationship between China and New Zealand, and you have also led the New Zealand government in adopting a rational, pragmatic and positive policy towards China. This is something we really appreciate.
Owen Poland, CGTN, Wellington.
Wang Yi is also travelling to Australia this week for the 7th Australia-China Foreign and Strategic Dialogue. It comes a few months after Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to Beijing helped ease tensions and improve ties. Alexander Downer, Australia's former Minister for Foreign Affairs, told Juliet Mann that resuming dialogue is important.
Well, it's important that there is a constructive dialogue between the senior levels of the Australian and Chinese government. I think this idea of not speaking to each other bears no fruit. I'm glad that both sides are engaging in discussion. They don't have to agree on everything, but they do need to be prepared to have frank conversations.
It is the first face-to-face for 7 years, and a lot has happened since then. Where would you say are the pressure points? There's things, as you said yourself, they're not going to agree on everything.
Well, I think the trade sanctions that China has introduced are completely counterproductive. They cost Australia, of course, but Australians will bear the cost. And they cost China in terms of access to cheap and reliable imports. So I think putting all that behind us will be a very good thing to do. It makes sense to have a robust trading relationship.
But there are lots of opportunities, aren't there, certainly for closer trade ties. I wonder which sectors in particular you think are going to draw investment.
Well, you never know. You've seen huge growth in all sorts of aspects of Sino-Australian trade, and I'd like to see the Australian wine export industry get back into business. I think it's pointless to have been imposing sanctions on Australian wine whilst importing wine from Europe and South America. So, I mean, I think that is an area where Australia and China can make great progress. But there are all sorts of areas where our trade can expand. There are obviously some sensitive areas. China doesn't want Australia to invest heavily in their domestic telecommunications sector, and likewise, Australia wouldn't welcome heavy Chinese investment in our telecommunications as an example of there being sensitive sectors, and we should be aware of that.
What about on things like climate change and the green transition? There are points of collaboration there, aren't there?
There are excellent points of collaboration there. I mean, China is, of course, a huge producer of batteries for electric vehicles, as the world's major producer of them, and Australia will need to import large numbers of electric cars. So Australia, nevertheless, is becoming a very major producer of critical minerals such as lithium, which is needed for batteries. So I can see as time goes on, in some of those very practical ways, there's collaboration. I mean, solar panels they're mainly made in China. I don't know if they all are, but they largely are. And then at the political level, Australia's committed to net zero by 2050. I mean, there's a real question as to whether Australia will come anywhere near meeting that, but that is the commitment Australia's made. China has a slightly different commitment. China is the largest CO2 emitter in the world, so everything China does assumes real significance in addressing the introduction of clean energy. But this is an area where we can collaborate.
China's industrial activity picked up at the start of the year. Figures from January and February show industrial production leapt 7% year-on-year, the fastest rate of growth in almost 2 years. At the same time, service activities saw 5.8% growth, particularly in hotels and catering, software, information technology and financial services.
We are confident of achieving 5% GDP annual growth in 2024 as major economic indexes continue to rebound, supporting policies having an impact. However, we must keep in mind that the situation abroad is still complex and volatile, with the world economy facing uncertain risks. Chinese domestic demand still remains inadequate, and the foundation of economic recovery is still not solid yet.
3 firefighters have been killed while battling wildfires in China's southwest Yunnan province, with the fires now said to be under control. Meanwhile, wildfires in neighbouring Sichuan province have forced the evacuation of 3,500 people from several villages. Over 1,200 firefighters are still working to put out the flames, which had initially been extinguished, but then reignited and spread after strong winds hit the area. An Icelandic volcano, which began erupting over the weekend, is continuing to spew lava and smoke. Authorities say that infrastructure around the fishing town of Grindavik remains safe for the time being, after man-made barriers successfully directed the lava flow away from important areas. It's the 4th time that the volcano has erupted since December, after being dormant for 800 years. Authorities say the eruptions have opened up a 3-kilometre-long fissure in the earth. Our headlines again. Israeli forces storm Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza as they track down Hamas fighters, ordering Palestinians to evacuate the area. The European Union's foreign policy chief accuses Israel of provoking famine in Gaza and using starvation as a weapon of war. And China's foreign minister visits New Zealand and Australia, his first trip there in 7 years. And that is The World Today. Thanks for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.